Hi, welcome to this week's With Liberty and Justice for Some. Earlier this week, the Secretary of Defense said that we're about to have $1 trillion budget. That's trillion with a T for a defense budget. Doge is raging and claiming they're trying to save money, and yet they've barely even looked at the $1 trillion defense budget that's pending. Well, today's guest is an expert on defense spending and how to reduce Pentagon spending, and his name is Bill Hartung with the Quincy Institute. Quincy Institute is for responsible statecraft. That means they are trying to make sure that we avoid war, and I think it's going to be an episode that is breaking down the Pentagon's budget, and I hope you enjoy it. But before we hear from Bill, let's first hear from the American Federation of Teachers President, Randy Weidengarten, with a very quick question for her. Got a simple question for you. Maybe not so simple, but I have a question for you. We're going to play a little bit of a fantasy Congress here a little bit. If you had the power to change any law in all of federal law, what law would you change?
Only
Simple
one?
question. Really simple.
Just,
One.
just one, huh?
Yep.
Okay. The number one law that I would change
Mhm.
is to ensure that no one could be a dictator in the United States of America, that we would find ways that people could actually maintain their democracy,
Mhm.
and there's lots of different ways to do it, but right now at this moment people are terrified that we are going to lose our democracy, that our courts may not hold, that the power, sorry, this is the old civics teacher talking,
Yeah.
that the Article 1 branch,
Yeah.
your branch, doesn't, it gets plowed under by the Article 2 branch, the executive branch. So if there's one thing I could do right now, it's that magically the Congress would come together and say, we are not giving up our republic to Donald Trump and to Elon Musk. Let's fight the issues, but we're not giving up our democracy, and we're not giving up our republic, and we're not giving up our Constitution. We elect presidents, not kings.
Who would think that this has to be a wish of a law we have to change or implement because we have someone abusing the system so often?
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Randy, for being with us. We really appreciate it today.
Thank you.
With all the talk of the Doge Commission finding cost savings in government, the one area congressional Republicans are already talking about spending more money is for the Pentagon. People who follow my work may know that former Congresswoman Barbara Lee and I formed the Pentagon Spending Reduction Caucus in Congress a few years back, and now Rep. Ilhan Omar and I are leading that caucus. Our goal? To be smarter about how we spend money for the Pentagon. Yes, our national security is important, but it's not always weapon systems that make us strong. It's what we do around the world to show our real strengths as a nation that makes us strong too. I have a very special guest with us today, an expert on foreign policy and specifically on our Pentagon's budget. Bill Hartung is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Stagecraft, a leading national organization that works for a more just and peaceful world through smarter foreign policy, represented by military restraint and diplomatic engagement. Bill focuses on the arms industry and the U.S. military budget. He's authored multiple books on the subject, worked with a variety of organizations on this, and is a regularly featured expert guest on national security issues with scores of media. It's a real honor to have Bill Hartung with us today. Hello, Bill. How are you?
Well, hello. It's an honor to be with you. I appreciate all the good work you're doing, and I can't imagine what it's like to be in the Congress right now.
It's interesting, I'll tell you, it used to be, new things would pop up every week. And, now it seems not even every day. Sometimes it's within the same day. There can be multiple variations of things. But, one thing though, that never changes though, Bill, is the love to spend money at the Pentagon, even during this time of, going around trying to find $2.5 trillion of cuts in federal programs. We've already been told the two areas that the Republicans want to increase funding is the Pentagon and Homeland Security. So I'll tell you, before we start that conversation, though, tell us a little more about the Quincy Institute. What is it, and what is it that you all do?
Well, yeah, we're a relative newcomer in Washington. I think just passed our fifth anniversary, and it was founded because it just seemed like when it came to spending on the Pentagon, when it came on the endless wars, there weren't enough voices for diplomacy, and so that's kind of our short version of our mission: is more diplomacy and less war. War only when it's really a serious existential national security threat, not because we don't have other tools in our toolbox or more imaginative ways to approach our problem. So anyway, so we take hits on this, that, and the other thing when we're viewed as not tough enough, or people say you're naive. To me, the ones who are naive are the hawks who think we can keep doing the same things over and over and over again and get different results. Because we've seen in the wars of this century that all the technology in the world is not going to solve your problems if you don't have a clear plan and a clear understanding of what you're getting yourself into. And I think we don't want to be putting our men and women in uniform in these kinds of situations without having a clear plan, which we have certainly done in our last few wars.
Yeah, and I think there was a real need for your organization, and thank you for that. In fact, I know we use a lot of the work that you guys put together. Thank you. Um, let's just talk a little bit first about the Pentagon's budget. I think that's the primary focus. And then if we have a little time, I'd love to talk about USAID and a little bit about Gaza, maybe. So let's start with the Pentagon. Almost every federal agency, they get audited on a regular basis, make sure we're protecting our taxpayers clearly. But the Pentagon is kind of unique when it comes to this. I think it's now failed 7 audits in a row. Can you just talk about that? The idea of how a major agency that's over half of our discretionary funds doesn't seem to have to pass the same fiscal responsibility as every other agency?
Well, they've clearly gotten a free pass on this, and none of us would get that. I mean,
Right.
if you can't balance your family budget, you're going to pay for it one way or the other. I think they argue, well, it's complex, or we've got other missions, but the fact is, if you can't keep track of the money, you can't prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. They've even had cases where they are buying things they already own because they can't keep track of components and so forth. So it's not sort of a separate issue. Here's war fighting, here's accounting, because they really have no idea essentially how much money they're wasting, and we can't afford that given this, especially the sharp trade-offs we're being forced to look at now.
You said a few times they can't keep track. Explain that a little more.
Well, if you ask them to back up, where did this expenditure go? Where did that expenditure go? Can you balance the books? They would not be able to do that. And likewise, if you asked for an inventory of their equipment, they'd fall short. And because they haven't passed an audit, we're still not quite wrapping our arms around how big this is, how wasteful on a day-to-day basis. But it's clearly no way to run an organization, especially one that's the biggest part of our discretionary budget.
And let's talk about that a little more because I don't think people really understand. We say the biggest part of our discretionary budget. We're talking almost 900 billion with a B billion dollars annually, and it goes up every single year. Can you talk a little bit about just how big that really is, what that means to people, and compare us to other countries, China and others. Obviously with all the rhetoric, you'd think China spends a lot more than us. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you're pushing towards a trillion, it's hard to think of the requisite comparisons. But for example, the discretionary budget is pretty much everything we do in government except payments like Medicare or Social Security. Every other agency in the government put together gets less than the Pentagon. So if you want to go with environmental problems, with climate, with pandemic, they're getting tiny fraction of what the Pentagon gets. In fact, the annual budget for the F-35 is larger than the entire annual budget of the Centers for Disease Control. Or a couple of years ago, Lockheed Martin had a good year for them, $75 billion in contracts, bigger than the State Department and AID combined. So some of the things that we need would be just sort of changing the couch cushions for the Pentagon, and yet we're told we need to spend every dime. And it kind of reminds me, I've been around for a while, but back in the '80s when they started finding out about the $600 toilet seat and $7,200 coffee makers. And this is when Kaiser Weinberger had said, "Oh, we can't, we can't touch a dime of the Pentagon budget." And
Yeah.
when this sort of flooded the zone, late night talk show hosts were joking about it. There was hearings on TV. There was huge media attention. In our environment now, it's much harder to get that kind of focus because there's, cases like TransDigm, which you're well aware of, which are higher jackups than we saw even back then. But it's a competition for people's, I think, attention, and also people's feeling that they can, make a difference, that they can push government to do better. That's not top of mind for a lot of folks.
So, how do we compare to China and other countries? I mean, that almost, pushing $1 trillion a year.
Well, we're at about 3 times what China spends,
Three.
and we spend more than the 3 times, yeah, and we spend more than the next 9 countries combined. But many of those countries are our allies.
Mhm.
So on the spending front, there's a huge disparity. It's really more a question of, are you spending on the right things? Do you have a smart strategy? Some of the folks who want to spend more, they'll say, "Oh, it's a smaller percentage of our gross domestic product." Well, our gross domestic product is 7 times what it was in the 1950s. That doesn't mean you have to spend 7 times as much on the Pentagon. And it's not an entitlement program that gets X amount of the GDP. It's supposed to be, what do we need to defend ourselves? And that seems to get pushed to the side in some of these conversations.
Yeah, wow. I mean, just the scale compared to other countries. I mean, that alone is significant. I mean, I think, what my theory is, one of the reasons why the Pentagon has this, really no one, you know, doesn't mind if people don't mind if they can't pass an audit. They don't mind that we're spending almost $1 trillion annually, is because it's become more of a jobs program for many, because every single district has companies that benefit from the Pentagon budget. I have a company in my district. I won't say their name right now, but they make a product that's about as big as your pinky, and it goes on submarines. And every year they come by and want me to buy more submarines than the Department of Defense even asked for, because they make that one little part on there, but it becomes this jobs program narrative. Can you just talk a little bit about how the defense industrial base and the defense lobbyists in Washington have made it difficult for Congress to ever really go after inefficient or failing weapons programs using this jobs argument?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people would assume that the Pentagon's propping up our entire economy, but that's not the case. It's a small percentage, but it's, as you said, it's in every district. They're well organized. They've got, most recently they had 900 lobbyists, almost two for every member of Congress. They hire folks from the Pentagon to turn around the lobby for them, and vice versa. You've got a lot of Silicon Valley military tech folks, very prominent in the Trump administration, and be able to work, on behalf of their interests. So, yeah, I think the problem is it's a political problem because research has shown that any other expenditure of funds on infrastructure or green energy or even a tax cut would create more jobs than spending on the military. But that money's already locked in, and people don't want to take that leap of, well, I have a job now, how do I know I'm going to get a job in the green economy and so forth? And also, there's the Pentagon, because it's got a national security kind of flag wrapped around it,
Mhm.
often is not looked at with the same level of scrutiny. And then some people, I do think, well, defense is a complicated thing. I'll let the experts take care of it. So there's a lot of reasons, but if we had I think President Biden got to start down that road of investing in some of the jobs of the future. And the problem of sticking pat, as we're doing now, is we're forfeiting our ability to build the jobs of the future, the economy of the future. So there's diminishing returns. In fact, my colleague Miriam Pemberton did a book on conversion from Pentagon to peaceful pursuits in different communities, and most of the places that had a lot of Pentagon money also had fairly high poverty rates. So it wasn't spreading throughout the community. It was sort of like this little silo that was being taken care of, and even within that, there's a very good young journalist, Taylor Barnes, who has found that even the industry says, well, we had 3 million jobs nationwide directly building weapons 30 years ago. Now it's 1 million because of automation and outsourcing, and they're building fewer units. And a lot of these people assume they're unionized jobs, but at some of the companies, that's all gone out the window. So they're not paying as well. There's not as many of them, but the problem is they exist. So as you said, even fairly small amounts of money can generate a lot of pressure on a member. So um, it's probably really is going to require presidential leadership to make the kind of shift that would be necessary. But I think we need to make the point repeatedly. I think if you don't have a vision of the future that you want, you're never going to get there. And as you know, the day-to-day battles can get really tough, even to get fairly small important things done. So I think we have to sort of raise the banner of what a better economy, better world would look like.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the point that you said about how it's a much less efficient way to create jobs than a lot of other federal programs, because of how much we're spending on this, really just shows that that argument isn't strong. But when someone hears from that contractor in their district, it's often hard for them to say that they're not going to fight to bring them money.
And also the executives of these companies make often $20 million a year, and they spend huge amounts of money not investing in plant and equipment or their workers, but bidding up their stock prices,
Mhm.
which serves nobody's interest in terms of national security. So they're a little bit untethered from the kind of monitoring that should occur, given that they're being paid to provide for our national security.
Well, make me feel a little better. At least are we getting a good value out of the Pentagon spending? I mean, do we have efficient weapon systems? Are they delivered on time and under cost? Are we getting a good value?
Well, no. I mean, occasionally, yes, but there's some big problems that are very costly, like the F-35, which when they introduced it 23 years ago, they said it was going to be a revolution in military procurement. It was going to be cheaper, it's going to be quicker. They're building versions for the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. So they said, oh, we'll have common parts, so economies of scale.
Mhm.
But none of that has played out because it's sort of like it's supposed to do everything and it doesn't do any of those tasks well. They're still fixing problems from the prior versions. The thing is not really done yet. It's not really fully ready for combat. It's in the hangar half the time or more. It's a very complex system. So it's pretty much almost like one of the current officials called it acquisition malpractice. And other
Mhm.
members have said it's like pouring money down a rat hole, but they feel like, well, we've spent X amount. Can we pull out now? I mean, they used to
Right.
say, there's only two times when you can kill a program, but it's either too early or too late. There's never like that right moment. But I think now, given that we don't really know what's the mix of piloted, unpiloted vehicles, what do we want for the future, they're still planning to buy well over 1,000 of these things. There's plenty of time for a rethink, rather than pour good money after bad. And one of the things that they made a huge mistake was they let Lockheed Martin control the software for fixing the thing. So
Mhm.
they've got the government over a barrel anytime there's any kind of complicated problem with the system. So there's that. There's the literal combat ship, which I sort of think of as the F-35 of the sea, because also multiple tasks, clear mines, bring troops close to shore, and it ends up it wasn't performing well, and also it doesn't really have a good role to play in any kind of scenario involving China because it can't defend itself. So that they were going to cancel them quite a bit early, and the reps from states where they're repaired pushed back. So I think the first year they wanted to retire 9, they managed to retire 4. But so the Pentagon, even from their own point of view, well, we want to move forward, want to move from this system to that system. Even kind of the basics of structuring your force run into this pork barrel politics, which is really, I mean, if you really built your whole military based on where the jobs were, there would be no rationality at all to how the weapons relate to a strategy. And so we're carrying some extra weight because of that. It gets in the way of a smart strategy and a straightforward approach. And of course, it wastes a good amount of money.
Well, let me ask about a few of these programs, and let me ask a little more on F-35s. I have a F-35 presence in my district, so this is something I try to follow extra close. If I remember right, too, didn't it was a couple years back, but they had something like 800 deficiencies, and I think they corrected like a single digits worth that year. And it's not like they're actually moving forward on this in any kind of a positive way.
No, no, they had 800 unresolved defects, and only a tiny fraction of them have been dealt with. and it was almost built in at the beginning. They had way back when, in the '60s, they had done a multi-role plane, which was so bad that our airline stopped using it because so many crashes. They called it the Widowmaker, and we should have thought back to that problem. It's just to have it do this many different things and to demand like more and more technology and cover technology just drives the price up and makes it more complicated to maintain. I think we're seeing that problem now. For example, in Ukraine, initially the U.S. was providing from stock so we could get it to them quickly. But when we have to produce it ourselves, our system's more complicated than the Russian systems. It takes us longer. We're not well equipped. We're not nimble for this kind of situation that's arisen. So at some point, I would go back to some of the thinking of the Military Reform Caucus, which was strongest in the '80s, which says, well, if it's simpler and it's reliable, you can build in more numbers, it does the job, you may well be better off than building these exquisite weapons where you're building fewer and fewer. The B-2 bomber, they were going to build 100, they could only afford 21. The F-22, they were going to build 750, they could only afford 189. So the argument was, well, they're quality weapons, but at a certain point that doesn't work. It's just too small and they're too hard to maintain. So we'd have to take somewhat of a different course, which would be, take time. But I think it's something to think about now when we're seeing the defects of our current approach.
Yeah. What's an F-35 on average cost? I should know this. I don't.
They're pushing around 130 million a plane.
Okay.
And there's all kinds of hidden costs, but that's the understanding. Now they throw on different numbers based on, well, do you want to count the engine or do you want to count whether it's ready to fly? But it should be around 130 million. Yeah.
Okay. And then we have to then do the fixing of it through Lockheed Martin because they have control of the software.
Yeah, they actually can make money from their own incompetence because they get
Wow.
paid to fix it.
Yeah. All right. Let me ask you about another one. The Ford class aircraft carrier, which I believe is one of the most recent versions. I hear they have an expensive problem with their plumbing that is essentially equivalent to flushing money down the drain. Can you talk about that?
Yes. The if they have to if they have to unclog the toilet, they use this expensive chemical. It costs $400,000 per repair. I mean, I live in New York and the plumbers are expensive, but it doesn't approach that.
Yeah. No,
Um,
400 grand. No.
and then the aircraft carrier as a whole runs about $13 billion, and then you've got all the ships that protect it, and the speed with which high speed, powerful missiles are being developed. Those carriers are eventually going to be sitting ducks, and so that's a huge investment to be making for something that might not be, useful on the battlefront in some years' time.
Now, this is one I'm going to admit I don't remember all the details, and you might, but I remember hearing this from someone who was a senior member on Armed Services that we had invested a lot of money into some amphibious ships. I think it was something like $8 billion, and these ships only sunk. Do you know much about that? Is that something you have? I am giving you very little to go on.
Yeah, I've seen reports about that, but it's sort of like whizzed by, much like our tax dollars are whizzing by our heads as we speak. But the Navy in general has had problems with maintenance. They have things like the Zumwalt destroyer, which they wanted to build 32, and they built 3 and decided it wasn't really worth the investment. So there's a lot of false starts as well, and I think it's because of having overly ambitious, overly technical requirements up front instead of figuring out, well, let's do the job. Can we keep it at sea? Not can it meet every possible, technological marvel?
Let's talk a little more on the Zumwalt, because if I understood it right, they were planning on 32 ships. I think they ultimately did 3 ships, but didn't we spend something like $22 billion for those 3 ships?
That is correct. Yes. It's just there's nowhere else in government that you could imagine that level of waste, except perhaps the nuclear warhead complex, which is under rubric of the Department of Energy. They've had some major, huge construction projects that have gone wrong, but I think those are the only 2 agencies that really are in the competition for wasting tens of billions of our tax dollars and getting almost nothing in return.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know that's not directly Pentagon spending because the way we do federal dollars, but tell me about some of those inefficiencies.
Well, there's a plant, Savannah River, Georgia. Originally, it was reprocessing nuclear materials that were bomb grade and then turning them into nuclear fuel and selling them to Russia as part of a nuclear risk reduction thing. But when that ended, they had this huge multi-billion-dollar plant. They said, well, let's convert it and we'll make triggers for nuclear bombs, which were not necessary. And so now they're engaged on this other huge construction project. They've probably spent $20 billion on that site and hasn't produced anything that's actually worked its way into our defense system in many, many years. And likewise, the nuclear weapons labs have considerable waste out in New Mexico, California. We haven't dealt with the legacy of the radioactive waste from our nuclear programs. A lot of it's just sitting there waiting for somebody to come up with a solution. So it's I think that the nuclear warhead complex, because it's kind of tucked away in a different agency, doesn't get the same kind of attention. I know, you remember Rick Perry is going to eliminate the Department of Energy once they reminded him, and
Yeah,
he didn't realize that it was
nuclear.
where nuclear warheads were made. So he had to double back on that.
Yeah. Just having this conversation, 22 billion, 20 million, 20 billion and nothing happened in Georgia, 22 billion on three, the Zumwalt class, 13 billion on the Ford class aircraft carriers. It's stunning that, as I look at right now, the current conversation, we'll come to it in a second, but on USAID and some of the dollars we invest in the bang for the buck, so to speak, we get for that versus just the complete waste of $20 billion at a crack. It's pretty astounding.
Yes, it really is, and I think you know if you put it front and forward, I mean, there shouldn't be a caucus in favor of waste, right? I mean,
Right.
whether you're a hawk, a dove, or in between, waste doesn't defend us. But yet, the system's been allowed to carry on. And in fact, I'm all for getting rid of paperwork, but my fear is that some of this talk of getting things done more quickly at the Pentagon is going to take the things we need, like independent testing and
Mhm.
having enough contracting officers to figure out if we're getting a good deal. There's no question. I mean, the piles of paper that you need to apply for any kind of weapon system are absurd. But if they go in there, we got to make sure they don't take care of the actual safeguards that we need.
Yeah. So you brought up defense contractors. I know that there's been accusations of price gouging, overcharging the government. What happens to them when they defraud us?
Well, very occasionally they'll pay a fine. Um, the TransDigm case, the inspector general did an audit and they found repeated cases of them overcharging by enormous amounts. But that's just one company. If you multiply that over the whole department, there's probably billions and billions of dollars going out the window. Part of it is they don't require the companies to give certified cost information about what things have cost in the past. So the government negotiators are flying a bit blind. In some cases, because of the consolidation of the industry, there's not a lot of choices of places to go. But in any case, it's hard to imagine a worse system for buying things you need than what we have now.
So you just brought up something else on the consolidation of the industry, and that has been a more recent phenomena, right? Where we used to have multiple bidders, and by multiple, maybe even into double digits of bidding. Now, there's times that we have single uh, bid only entities because of consolidation, which of course is incredibly inefficient. Can you talk a little bit about the consolidation in the industry?
Yeah, there's been a couple waves. There was one after the end of the Cold War, where firms like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and RTX became many times larger than they had been by absorbing their rivals. Lockheed Martin was the result of 22 different companies being
Wow.
consolidated into one. And then more recently, there's been another wave. I mean, RTX was just recently, that was a big merger. So then you've also got the problem of some of the suppliers feel like the big companies are cutting them out a bit, that they're taking a bigger percentage of the contract than is warranted by the amount of work they do. Because a lot of the more sophisticated things are done by subcontractors. But I think, the Pentagon itself said that they had maybe 50 major suppliers in the 90s versus 5 now. Um, so that just gives the government very few choices on a lot of these big programs.
Yeah, no, incredibly inefficient. What else should people know about the Pentagon budget? Anything else that's worth highlighting?
Um, well, I think ultimately, and this is a very hard thing to do, but um, we need to talk about uh, what defense strategy do we want to have? Do we have to be able to fight everywhere in the world on short notice? Should we make allies bolster a part of their own defense? What are the situations where it's worth, uh, that momentous decision of going to war? I think we need to rethink that because the Pentagon's documents are a bit fuzzy. I mean, there's hardly anything they won't agree we should do. And so, if you have to be able to win a war with Russia or China and also fight Iran and North Korea, also fight a global war on terrorism and send troops to the border and use them to supervise, development projects. I mean, it's sort of like the Pentagon's become this all-purpose repository of everybody's dreams of what they think we should be doing. Some of them are things we shouldn't do. Some of the things we should partner with other countries to do. And I think in the day to day of slugging out the budget and the kind of fire hose of crises that's coming at us now, it's hard to have that conversation, but we have to make room for it somewhere, I think.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things, and slightly change the conversation now to, you also stand for, it doesn't always have to be a defense weapon system that helps us around the world. And, one of the programs I think that many of us found value in was the work that USAID was doing. And right now, the Trump administration essentially is stealing from these programs to help pay for a giant tax cut for the wealthiest, for the Elon Musk of the world. But USAID, 10,000 or so employees and contractors, and we've seen plans they want to reduce it down to as few as 300, and they're going to have the State Department absorb it. And I know people who work there, and the sign was being taken down before even the orders had come from the president. But can you talk a little bit about why non non-weaponry, I don't know, I'm giving it a bad term, why USAID is important, I guess, and what real value it brings to people in my district in Wisconsin, what they should know about why USAID is important.
Well, I think, it's part of our face to the world. I don't want the world to think we're just that the military is the only thing we know how to do.
Mhm.
And some of the best things we do in the world, whether it get clean water to people, sustain refugee camps, provide health care, fight HIV, a lot of that comes through AID. And there's been criticisms over the year of this big project, that big project, but there's a core there of things that are essential to people's lives, and that wins goodwill for the United States. It holds out a possibility of countries stabilizing, becoming more self-sufficient, and therefore less likely to be havens for terror or in the midst of civil wars or destabilizing their region. So it's really an investment in the hope that we can get to the point where, you know, fighting with weapons is not such a prevalent part of our international society, and that's good for everybody. And I think especially for us, given that our strategy has sort of engaged us in so many of the conflicts around the world.
Well, and it seems like there's a character assassination going on of USAID in particular. I think Elon Musk said he calls it the radical left Marxists who hate America. We know that's ridiculous, but they've done a good job of claiming Nancy Pelosi got $137 million, which we know isn't true. They've claimed a bunch of programs. Politico, a news source that Donald Trump's mad at, claimed it was $8 million. I think it turned out to be 40 some thousand. Like, can you just talk a little bit about some of the attacks and the the lies behind these attacks on an agency like USAID?
Well, a part of it is our media environment. The people who yell the loudest get heard, and the corrections get buried.
Yeah.
And I think probably we need to be more vocal all the time about what works in government. I think a lot of people, even progressives, spend more time criticizing government than saying, well, here's something that is being done well that should be sustained, that's important. And if you haven't set that foundation, then when they come in with these ridiculous attacks, you don't have as much to work with. People haven't been educated to the fact, they won't say, wait a minute, but what about this good thing they did? Or wait a minute, what about that? It's almost like a free fire zone if we don't set the foundations of explaining to people that government has done good things, can do good things. There's things we can invest in to do even better. So at the same time, yes, we want the Pentagon to clean up its act. No, we don't want corruption in government. Yes, we want our tax dollars spent well. That doesn't mean taking a wrecking ball to an incredibly valuable agency. If they want to do a review and fix some pieces, but to just throw the whole thing out is just so terribly wasteful. It's going to cost lives around the world. It's going to hurt our reputation, and even what they've done so far, it's going to be hard to, I think, to fix.
Do you think there's anything to, and I'll admit it's been in my hearsay world more than anything else, but supposedly Elon Musk, his contract with Starlink that they had with USAID was under review, and some people think part of the reason why that was the first agency they went after was for that reason, because right now Elon Musk has this outsized influence as a special government employee who can turn on and off the spigots of federal funding for any agency, but he's also got federal contracts with those agencies, which of course members of Congress and the public or the federal employees can't have. There's obviously that leads to corruption, but do you know anything about that issue, that perhaps Elon Musk had a personal beef with all of this?
Well, I don't have the smoking gun. I've seen the reports. I mean, the problem is, why should this be a question? Why is there somebody making those kinds of decisions who could act in his personal interest to do that kind of damage? I think that could be a piece of it. Also, his view of the world and many of his colleagues is, oh, you don't need government. We'll take care of it. And of course, they can't take care of it. In fact, they're creatures of government to begin with. If it wasn't for government research, they wouldn't exist. So I think there is this kind of hardline anti-government piece, but also just petty personal grievances play a role, unfortunately. But I mean, not only is SpaceX launching most of our military satellites, but they have a new vehicle that's supposed to put a lot more tonnage in space at one time, and it's being touted as, oh, this is our ticket to getting ahead of China and winning the next war. So he only stands to get more and more government money as time goes on. And so I can't imagine a worse idea than putting a major government contractor in charge of basically taking apart our budget. And they've gone a lot further than there was sort of this impression, oh, it's advisory. I mean, they're going into agencies. I mean, they're locking people out of their offices. They're taking actions that are going to the courts that may not be even legal. This is an unbelievably kind of assertive power grab that goes well beyond efficiency.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting time to be living through and seeing this happen at the federal level. If I can, just in the remaining time, one last subject that we're going to have a special episode on this at some point in the near future, but just looking what's happening right now in the Middle East and particularly in Gaza. I don't even really know where to begin, but what is the current state of affairs, and what concerns do you have with where we are with this kind of a ceasefire, kind of a releasing of hostages, Donald Trump insinuating that the U.S. should take over Gaza and Palestinians can't come back. I mean, it's a lot to unpack, but love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, anything that slows the killing and gets some of the hostages free is a good thing. But so much damage has been done, and the ceasefire is so fragile. And this discussion of, ethnic cleansing of the entire territory of Gaza to do what? Put up vacation home? I don't know. It's just so beyond. It's just hard to believe that this is being said by a president of the United States, because it's going to be, given all the damage that's been done in Gaza, it's going to be a huge undertaking to figure out how to make that a viable place to live again. But the idea that you can take 2 million people and just throw them to the winds and let other countries take care of it is just a fantasy. And of course, we still have leverage. I mean, we're still Israel's biggest supplier of military aid, and I don't see that leverage being used in this case. But it's, we've gone so far down the road. It's so tragic that somebody's got to say it's time to step back. It's time to at least try to repair the damage and move in a positive direction, because this thing has been escalating, and we don't know if that escalation has really been reined in yet, and we can't allow an ally, however close they've been over the years, to call the shots as to when we're going to put our troops and our military folks at risk. So everything's a little bit backwards now, I think, in terms of using our influence in the region, and it's hurting us.
Yeah, I think it's one of the toughest decisions I have to make as a policymaker is if you're going to put young men and women into harm's way, right? That official decision, which is why um, the work that you all do is so important, right? Trying to have responsible stagecraft, how to have diplomatic ways of addressing things rather than just military. And I appreciate that. Is there any other subject that you want to? I try to cover a lot, mainly around defense spending, but anything else that you want to raise that you think is particularly important at this um, juncture in time?
Uh, well, I think probably the same thing that's on everybody's mind, which is how to reinvigorate our democracy, which is under assault. Because if we don't do that, any other thing we care about is not going to be doable. And I think people are surprised at how fragile our freedoms are. I think you sort of assume certain rules are going to be followed, and there'll be at least some guardrails around how bad things can get. But that's being called into question now, and so I think people have to really think about what it means to be a citizen. The answers aren't easy, but clearly we can't just hunker down and let this go on without some real serious pushback.
Yeah. Well, thank you. How does one follow you or the Quincy Institute? What do you want to share? Social media, other information? Please do that.
Oh yeah, well it's quincyinst.org, or if you just Google Quincy Institute, you'll either get us or Quincy Jones or Quincy, Massachusetts, and you'll be able to tell the difference. Um, and then I write for outlets like The Nation and Tom Dispatch and Forbes, but a lot of my stuff is up on my page on the Quincy site.
Bill Hartung, thank you very much for being with us today, and thanks for having a talk about something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The amount
Well,
we spend.
thank you for your work. I feel privileged to be able to speak to this while you're in the trenches dealing with it every day. So.
Well, thanks so much, Bill. Really appreciate it.